The gunshot that ripped through the dusty air of Redemption Creek wasn't meant to kill, just to halt the desperate flight of a woman whose tattered blue dress billowed behind her like a flag of surrender. Nora Jackson stumbled, her bare feet bloody from the unforgiving terrain, but she didn't fall. She couldn't afford to fall. Not now, not when freedom was so tantalizingly close. It was 1875, and the Wyoming Territory was still wild in ways that had nothing to do with the untamed landscape. Sheriff Harlan Pierce holstered his smoking Colt as he approached on horseback, his weathered face betraying nothing but cold determination. "That's far enough, Miss Jackson," he called out, his voice carrying across the scrubby terrain. "You know the law as well as I do." Nora's chest heaved as she turned to face her pursuer, her dark hair whipping across her face in the hot summer wind. "There is no law that says I belong to him," she said, her voice stronger than her trembling legs suggested. "The papers say different." Sheriff Pierce dismounted, his boots kicking up dust. "Mr. Edwards has the bill of sale. You're his property until he says otherwise." "I'm a person," Nora cried, backing away slowly. "Not cattle, not land." The sheriff sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. "That ain't for me to decide. Court in Cheyenne already ruled. Now come along peacefully, or I'll have to bring you back less pleasantly." That's when they heard the rhythmic pounding of approaching hooves. Both turned to see a rider cresting the nearby hill, silhouetted against the burning orange sky. Vaughn Garrison rode his palomino hard, reining the animal to a stop between the sheriff and Nora. Dust swirled around them as the horse pawed the ground. "What seems to be the trouble, Sheriff?" Vaughn asked, his voice deceptively casual. Only the white-knuckled grip on his reins betrayed his tension. Sheriff Pierce spat a stream of tobacco juice. "No trouble that concerns you, Garrison. I'm retrieving Mr. Edwards' property. She ran off 3 days ago." Vaughn's eyes flicked to Nora, taking in her desperate state, the bruises visible on her arms, the haunted look in her eyes. Something inside him hardened to steel. "She's not property," he said quietly, then louder, "She's a person, and she's my heart." The declaration hung in the air, surprising even Vaughn himself with its truth. He'd known Nora for less than a month since she'd arrived in town with Edwards. But in that time, their stolen conversations at the general store, her quiet dignity despite her circumstances, had worked their way under his skin until he could think of little else. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his holster. "Don't make this your fight, Cowboy. Edwards is a powerful man." "I reckon some fights choose you," Vaughn replied, dismounting slowly. He stepped toward Nora, who watched him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Miss Jackson, would you like to come with me?" "She doesn't have a choice in the matter," Pierce interrupted. "I'm asking her anyway," Vaughn said, not taking his eyes off Nora. Her voice was barely audible. "Yes," then stronger. "Yes, I would." Vaughn nodded once, then turned back to the sheriff. "I'm taking her to Judge Wilson in Silver Creek. He'll sort this out proper." "Judge Wilson?" The sheriff scoffed. "That old fool believes in all sorts of nonsense about equal rights. That's why we're going to him." Sheriff Pierce considered his options, eyeing the Winchester rifle in Vaughn's saddle holster. "Edwards won't take this lying down. I'd be disappointed if he did." Vaughn helped Nora onto his horse, noting how she winced as her feet left the ground. "We'll be seeing you, Sheriff." As they rode away, Nora holding tightly to his waist, Vaughn knew he'd just made an enemy of the most influential man in the territory. But with Nora's head resting against his back, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "Why did you do that?" she asked after they'd ridden in silence for several miles. Vaughn considered his answer carefully. "Because it was right. And because from the moment I saw you, I knew my life wouldn't be the same." She stiffened slightly. "I don't need saving, Mr. Garrison." "Vaughn," he corrected. "And I'm not saving you, I'm just giving you a fair chance to save yourself." The sun was setting as they approached Silver Creek, casting long shadows across the land. Vaughn knew they couldn't stay in town. Edwards would send men after them, and Judge Wilson wouldn't be able to hold court until morning. "We'll camp in the foothills tonight," he decided. "My friend owns a cabin up there. We'll be safe until morning." Nora nodded, too exhausted to argue. When they reached the small, hidden cabin, Vaughn helped her down, carrying her the last few steps when he saw how raw her feet were. Inside, he lit a lamp and set her gently on a chair. "Let me look at those," he said, nodding toward her feet as he fetched water and clean rags. "How do you know Judge Wilson will help?" she asked as he knelt before her, gently cleaning the dirt and blood from her feet. "He believes in the law, the real law, not whatever version men like Edwards and Pierce twist to their benefit." Vaughn worked methodically, his touch gentle, "And he owes me a favor. I saved his grandson from drowning last spring." As he bandaged her feet, Nora studied him in the lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes that contrasted with the weathered hardness of the rest of him. "You barely know me," she said softly. Vaughn looked up, his hands pausing their work. "I know enough. I know you deserve better than to be treated as property. The rest, well, I'd like the chance to learn. And if Judge Wilson rules against me," his jaw tightened, "then we keep riding. There's Canada or Mexico. You'd leave everything behind for a woman you barely know." Vaughn finished bandaging her foot before answering. "Some things matter more than land or possessions. Freedom is one of them." He rose and moved to the small stove, stoking a fire and setting coffee to boil. "Rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." As promised, morning arrived with startling swiftness. They rode into Silver Creek just as the town was waking, the streets beginning to bustle with early risers. Judge Wilson's house stood at the end of the main street, a modest two-story structure that also served as his courtroom. The judge himself answered their knock, a tall man with silver hair and keen eyes that took in Nora's condition and Vaughn's protective stance in one glance. "Garrison," he said by way of greeting. "Trouble follows you like a shadow." "Not my shadow this time, Judge. May we come in?" Judge Wilson stepped aside, ushering them into his parlor-turned-courtroom. As Vaughn explained the situation, the judge's expression grew increasingly grim. "A bill of sale, you say?" He turned to Nora. "May I ask how such a document came to exist, Miss Jackson?" Nora's hands twisted in her lap. "My father died owing Mr. Edwards a substantial debt. Edwards told me he'd take our farm unless—" She swallowed hard. "Unless I agreed to work for him to pay it off, he had me sign papers. I thought they were about the debt, but they were something else entirely," the judge finished, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Did you read them before signing?" "I tried, but Mr. Edwards said there wasn't time. The bank was closing and we'd lose everything if I didn't sign immediately." Judge Wilson sighed. "A common tactic, and where is your mother in all this?" "She died when I was 15, sir. It was just my father and me until last winter when the pneumonia took him." The judge nodded slowly, then turned to his bookshelf, pulling down a heavy tome. "The law on this matter is complicated, but there's precedent. A case in Missouri last year ruled that debt servitude agreements cannot constitute ownership of a person." Vaughn leaned forward. "So the bill of sale is invalid, potentially, but we'll need to see the actual documents." Judge Wilson looked up sharply. "And we'll need to hold a proper hearing with Edwards present." "He won't come willingly," Vaughn warned. "Then I'll issue a summons." "He can come willingly or be brought by the federal marshal." The judge turned to Nora. "In the meantime, Miss Jackson, you'll need somewhere safe to stay." "She'll stay with me," Vaughn said immediately, then caught himself. "That is, I have a spare room at my ranch. It's far enough outside town that Edwards' men won't find her easily." Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Very well, I'll send word when the hearing is set. It may take a few days to arrange." As they left the judge's house, Vaughn could feel the weight of eyes on them from all around the small town. News traveled fast in places like Silver Creek. "We should leave quickly," he murmured, helping Nora onto his horse. "I don't like how many people have seen us." True to his word, Vaughn's ranch lay nestled in a verdant valley some 10 miles outside town. The modest house sat on a rise overlooking pastures where cattle grazed lazily in the afternoon sun. A small creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. "It's beautiful," Nora said as they approached, the first words she'd spoken since leaving the judges. Vaughn felt an unexpected surge of pride. "It's not much, but it's mine, paid for free and clear last year." Inside, the house was simple but well kept. Vaughn showed her to the spare room, apologizing for its plainness. "I don't entertain much," he explained, watching as she took in the narrow bed and chest of drawers. "There are some clothes in there that might fit you. They belonged to my sister before she married and moved to California." "Thank you." Nora turned to face him, determination in her eyes. "I need you to understand something, Mr. Garrison." "Vaughn," he corrected automatically. "Vaughn," she acknowledged. "I'm grateful for your help, truly, but I won't trade one form of ownership for another." He blinked, taken aback. "That's not what I know, but men have a way of believing they own what they protect. I need to be clear from the start. I am my own person. I make my own choices. I won't be beholden to you or any man again." Vaughn studied her for a long moment, respect blooming alongside the attraction he'd been fighting. "Fair enough. You're a guest in my home, not a ward, and once this is settled, you'll be free to go wherever you please." Relief softened her features. "Thank you." The next few days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Vaughn rose early to work the ranch, returning mid-morning to find Nora had prepared breakfast. Despite her protests that she didn't need to earn her keep, she seemed eager to contribute, to prove her worth beyond being the object of his protection. They talked during meals cautiously at first, then with growing ease. He learned that she'd been raised on a small farm in Missouri, that she could recite Tennyson from memory, that she'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher before her father's illness had consumed their savings. She learned that he'd fought briefly for the Union before the war ended, that he'd drifted west afterward, unable to return to a Tennessee home that no longer existed, that he read voraciously during the long winter months when the ranch work slowed, that he'd built this place from nothing but determination, and the wages he'd saved working other men's land. On the third evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Nora asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Did you mean what you said to the sheriff about me being your heart?" Vaughn's hands stilled on the coffee cup he'd been holding. "I said what I needed to say to get you away from him." "I see." Her voice was carefully neutral. He looked over at her at the way the dying light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't true." Her eyes met his, questioning. "I barely know you," he admitted, "but I know enough to recognize something rare, something worth fighting for." Before she could respond, they heard the approaching thunder of hooves. Vaughn was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Inside," he ordered, all softness gone from his voice. "Now." Nora hesitated only a moment before complying, slipping through the door as Vaughn stepped to the edge of the porch. Positioning himself squarely in front of the entrance, 5 riders emerged from the tree line, dust billowing behind them. Vaughn recognized Edward's foreman, a brutal man named Silas, leading the group. "Evening, gentlemen," Vaughn called as they reined to a stop in his yard. "You're a long way from Edward's spread." Silas dismounted slowly, deliberately. "We've come for the girl, Garrison." "Mr. Edwards wants what's his." "There's no girl here that belongs to anyone," Vaughn replied evenly. "But if you're referring to Miss Jackson, she's under the protection of Judge Wilson's court pending a hearing." "That's so," Silas spat, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Funny, 'cause Sheriff Pierce says she's stolen property and we got every right to retrieve her." "Sheriff Pierce doesn't have jurisdiction here. This is federal territory." One of the other men laughed harshly. "You think that matters out here? Law is what men with guns say it is." "If that's your belief," Vaughn said, his voice dangerously soft, "then I suggest you count the guns in this situation very carefully." As if on cue, the door opened behind him and Nora stepped out, a rifle held steadily in her hands. "I believe the count is even," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor Vaughn could detect beneath it. Silas's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Edwards won't be pleased." "Mr. Edwards can present his case at the hearing like a civilized man," Vaughn replied. "Now I suggest you boys turn around and ride back the way you came. My hospitality doesn't extend to trespassers after sunset." For a tense moment, Vaughn was certain violence would erupt in his front yard. Then Silas gave a curt nod, mounting his horse with deliberate slowness. "This ain't over, Garrison," he called as they turned to leave. Not by a long shot. Only when the riders had disappeared from view did Vaughn allow himself to relax slightly. He turned to find Nora still holding the rifle with impressive steadiness. "Where did you learn to handle a firearm like that?" he asked, gently taking it from her. "My father taught me. He said a woman alone on a farm needed to know how to protect herself." Her voice caught. "I never thought I'd need to use that knowledge against other people." Vaughn checked that the rifle was properly secured before setting it aside. "They'll be back," he said grimly, "and in greater numbers next time. What do? We don't wait for them to return on their terms." He met her gaze directly. "I think it's time we take the fight to Edwards." Early the next morning, they rode for Silver Creek. Nora, now properly attired in a set of Vaughn's sisters' clothes, a practical riding skirt and blouse that allowed her to mount her own horse, a gentle mare Vaughn kept for occasional visitors. Judge Wilson received them in his study, his expression grave as they relayed the previous night's encounter. "I feared as much," the judge sighed. "Edwards has considerable influence with Sheriff Pierce. They've been associates since before the war." "We need to force the hearing sooner rather than later," Vaughn pressed. "Before Edwards decides to take matters into his own hands more forcefully." The judge nodded slowly. "I've sent the summons, but there's been no response. I was prepared to give him until the end of the week, but under the circumstances." He rose, moving to his desk. "I'll write to the federal marshal in Cheyenne today. He can be here within 2 days. And in the meantime," Nora asked. "In the meantime," the judge said, his eyes shrewd, "I suggest you stay somewhere Edwards wouldn't think to look. Not your ranch, Garrison, that's too obvious now." "I have a friend," Vaughn said after a moment's consideration. "Daniel White Eagle. His family's land borders the eastern edge of mine. Edwards and his kind don't venture there if they can help it." The judge's eyebrows rose. "The Arapaho settlement, are you certain they'll welcome you?" "Daniel served with me in the war. We've maintained good relations. His people have no love for men like Edwards." Judge Wilson nodded slowly. "Very well, I'll send word to you there when the marshal arrives." They left town as inconspicuously as possible, taking a roundabout route to the eastern boundaries of Vaughn's land. As they rode, Nora studied his profile against the vast blue sky. "Your friend Daniel. Will his people truly welcome strangers?" Vaughn smiled slightly. "Daniel's father is a tribal elder who believes in judging people by their actions, not their origins. They've had peaceful relations with some settlers, hostile ones with others, will be welcome." True to his word, when they arrived at the small settlement nestled against the foothills, they were greeted without hostility, if with some reservation. Daniel White Eagle, a tall man with intelligent eyes and a commanding presence, stepped forward to meet them. "Vaughn Garrison," he said, clasping Vaughn's arm in greeting. "It has been many moons since you visited." "Too many," Vaughn agreed. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced and with trouble at my heels." Daniel's eyes shifted to Nora, curious but not unwelcoming. "Trouble often brings opportunity for true character to reveal itself. Come, you will share our fire and tell us what brings you here." Over a simple meal, Vaughn explained their situation. Daniel listened intently, occasionally translating parts for his father and the other elders who had joined them. When Vaughn finished, there was a long silence broken only by the crackling fire. "This man, Edwards," Daniel said finally, "he believes he can own a person because of marks on paper." "He does," Nora answered, meeting Daniel's gaze steadily. "Many white men still believe such things are possible, especially when it comes to women or people they consider beneath them." Daniel's father, Gray Wolf, spoke in Arapaho, his weathered face solemn. Daniel translated, "My father says that such men are ill in their spirits. They have forgotten that all people are born from the same earth, breathe the same air, and return to the same ground in death." "Your father is wise," Nora said softly. Gray Wolf nodded to her, then spoke again at length. When he finished, Daniel turned to them. "You may stay with us until your judge sends word. My father says that a woman who stands against those who would own her has the spirit of a warrior and deserves the protection of warriors." Nora blinked rapidly. touched by the unexpected acceptance. "Thank you." They were given a small lodge at the edge of the settlement. As Vaughn helped secure their horses for the night, Daniel approached him alone. "The woman, she matters to you," he observed. It wasn't a question. Vaughn nodded, seeing no point in denying it. "More than I expected her to." "And does she know this?" "I think so, but her freedom matters more than my feelings." Daniel smiled slightly. "Perhaps to you, but to her, women often have different priorities than men imagine." Before Vaughn could respond, Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "Rest well, my friend. Tomorrow I will show you both where our boundaries meet. It is good for allies to know each other's lands." The next morning dawned clear and bright. After a simple breakfast, Daniel led them on horseback along the eastern edge of the settlement's territory, pointing out landmarks and hunting grounds. Nora listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that clearly impressed their guide. "Your woman has a quick mind," Daniel commented to Vaughn when Nora had ridden slightly ahead. "She's not my woman," Vaughn corrected. "And yes, she does." Daniel gave him a knowing look. "Not yet, perhaps." They were returning to the settlement when they spotted a rider approaching from the direction of Silver Creek. Vaughn tensed, hand moving to his sidearm, but Daniel raised a hand. "It is Thomas Running Deer, my cousin. He works in Silver Creek at the livery." The young man rode directly to them, his expression urgent. "Daniel Vaughn," he greeted them breathlessly. "I bring news. Edwards and his men are in town. They have taken Judge Wilson hostage in his own home." "What?" Vaughn's blood ran cold. "When?" "This morning. They demand that he sign papers declaring the woman as Edwards' legal property. They say if he does not, they will burn the courthouse with him inside." Nora had ridden back to join them, her face paling as she heard the news. "This is because of me," she whispered. "No," Vaughn said firmly. "This is because Edwards is a man who believes his wealth puts him above the law." Daniel was already turning his horse. "We must return to the village. My father will want to hear this news." Back at the settlement, a council was quickly convened. Grey Wolf listened gravely to the report, then spoke at length, his hands moving in emphatic gestures. "My father says this is not only your fight," Daniel translated. "Judge Wilson has been fair to our people when others were not. If men like Edwards believe they can ignore the law when it does not serve them, none of us are safe." Vaughn nodded. "I agree, but I can't ask your people to risk themselves in a white man's quarrel." Grey Wolf spoke again, his voice firm. Daniel's translation came with a slight smile. "He says you did not ask. We offer. 10 of our best warriors will ride with you." "Thank you," Vaughn said, inclining his head respectfully to the elder. "We should leave immediately. Edwards won't wait long for his demands to be met." As preparations began, Nora pulled Vaughn aside, her eyes fierce. "I'm coming with you." "Nora, it's too dangerous. This is my fight more than anyone's," she interrupted. "I won't hide while others risk their lives for my freedom." Vaughn recognized the determination in her expression, the same unyielding strength that had first drawn him to her. "All right," he conceded, "but you stay behind me and you follow my instructions without question." Within the hour, their party was ready. Vaughn and Nora, Daniel, and 10 Arapaho warriors armed with a mix of traditional weapons and firearms. They rode hard for Silver Creek, taking a route that would bring them into town from the west, hopefully surprising Edwards and his men. As they approached, Vaughn outlined his plan. "We need to assess the situation before charging in." "Daniel, can your men surround the judge's house without being seen?" Daniel nodded. "Like shadows." "Good. Nora and I will approach openly from the main street." "Edwards knows we're coming. He'll be watching for us. That should distract his lookouts while your men get into position." "And then?" Nora asked. "Then we improvise," Vaughn said grimly. Silver Creek was unnaturally quiet as they rode down the main street, most citizens having barricaded themselves indoors at the first sign of trouble. Judge Wilson's house stood at the far end, and even from a distance, they could see men posted on the porch and at the windows. "Ready?" Vaughn asked softly. Nora straightened in her saddle. "Ready." They rode forward at a measured pace, making no attempt to conceal their approach. As expected, their presence caused immediate activity around the judge's house. Men moved into defensive positions, rifles trained on the approaching riders. Edwards himself emerged onto the porch, a satisfied smile spreading across his fleshy face. "Well, well," he called. "The thief returns with my property." Vaughn and Nora halted their horses in the middle of the street, just out of effective rifle range. "Let Judge Wilson go, Edwards," Vaughn called back. "This is between you and me." "And the girl," Edwards corrected. "Don't forget why we're all here. She signed a contract fair and square." "There was nothing fair about it," Nora called, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You tricked me and you know it," Edwards shrugged. "Cleverness has its rewards. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to dismount, Miss Jackson, and walk over here to me. Then Garrison is going to turn around and ride away. If either of you fails to comply, the judge dies." "And if we do as you say?" Vaughn asked. "What guarantee do we have that you'll release Wilson?" Edwards laughed. "None whatsoever, but it's the only chance he's got." Vaughn glanced at Nora, a silent message passing between them. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. "All right," Vaughn called, raising his hands. "No need for anyone to get hurt." He began to dismount slowly, making a show of keeping his hands visible. Edwards gestured to his men. "Keep your weapons on them. Silas, go fetch the girl." The foreman moved forward, a smug grin on his weathered face. As he approached, Vaughn continued to act compliant, shoulders slumped in apparent defeat. It was at that precise moment that war cries split the air. The Arapaho warriors emerged from all sides, arrows nocked and rifles aimed. Edwards' men swiveled in confusion, suddenly finding themselves surrounded. In the chaos, Vaughn moved with lightning speed, drawing his revolver and firing a precise shot that knocked the gun from Silas's hand. The foreman howled in pain, clutching his bleeding fingers. "Judge Wilson," Vaughn shouted toward the house. "Are you all right?" "I'm here," came the judge's voice from inside. Unharmed but restrained, Edwards, face purpling with rage, yanked his own pistol from its holster. "This changes nothing. I'll kill him before I let you." He never finished the sentence. An arrow thudded into the porch support beside his head, so close that splinters embedded in his cheek. He froze, eyes wide with fear. "The next one won't miss," Daniel called calmly. "Release the judge." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Edwards slowly lowered his weapon. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Actually," came a new voice, "I believe it is." All heads turned to see a tall figure approaching on horseback, the silver badge of a U.S. Marshal gleaming on his chest. Behind him rode several deputies, all armed and ready. "Marshal Thompson," Judge Wilson called from inside, "your timing is impeccable." "Came as soon as I got your message, Judge," the marshal replied, dismounting. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "Mr. Edwards, I presume." "You're under arrest for kidnapping a federal judge, among other charges I'm sure we'll discover." "This is outrageous," Edwards spluttered. "These savages attacked my men, and that woman is my legal property. I have the papers to prove it." The marshal's expression hardened. "Those savages, as you call them, appear to be preventing a crime. As for your claim of ownership." He turned to Judge Wilson, who had been freed and was now standing in the doorway. "Judge, Miss Jackson's case was already under review," Wilson confirmed. "Mr. Edwards attempted to circumvent due process through intimidation and violence. Furthermore, I've examined the so-called bill of sale. It's a fraudulent document disguised as a labor contract." "That settles it then," the marshal said, nodding to his deputies to take Edwards into custody. "Mr. Edwards, you'll be facing charges in federal court. Kidnapping a judge tends to be frowned upon." As Edwards was led away, shouting threats and imprecations, Vaughn turned to Nora. Her face was alight with a mixture of disbelief and dawning joy. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "Truly over." Judge Wilson approached them, straightening his disheveled clothing. "It is indeed, Miss Jackson. Marshal Thompson will ensure Edwards faces justice for his actions. As for the fraudulent ownership claim, I'm prepared to rule on that immediately." He cleared his throat formally. "The court finds that Nora Jackson is, and has always been, a free citizen with all rights thereof. Any documents suggesting otherwise are hereby declared null and void." Nora's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced the startled judge. "Thank you," she whispered. The aftermath unfolded gradually. Edwards was taken to Cheyenne to await trial, his operation left in disarray. Sheriff Pierce, implicated in the scheme, fled rather than face charges. Judge Wilson appointed a temporary replacement until proper elections could be held. Daniel and his warriors were publicly thanked by the judge for their assistance, a gesture that raised eyebrows among some townspeople, but was met with approval by many others. It was a small step, but a meaningful one in a territory where relations between settlers and native peoples were often strained. As for Vaughn and Nora, they found themselves at a crossroads. With her freedom legally secured, the question of what came next hung between them. A week after the confrontation, they stood on Vaughn's porch, watching the sunset as they had on that evening that seemed so long ago now. "Judge Wilson says I'm entitled to compensation," Nora said, breaking a comfortable silence. "From Edward's assets. For false imprisonment and uncompensated labor." "That's good," Vaughn replied. "You deserve it." He also mentioned that the schoolteacher position in Silver Creek is open. The previous teacher left after the incident. Vaughn turned to look at her, heart suddenly pounding. "Are you considering it?" Nora met his gaze. "I am, but I wanted to ask how you'd feel about that." "How I'd feel?" He searched for the right words. "Nora, your choices are your own. That was the whole point of everything we've been through." "I know that." She stepped closer to him. "But some choices affect others. If I stay, it would be because I want to see where this could lead." She gestured between them. "Unless I've misunderstood." "You haven't," he said quietly. "I meant what I said that day. You are my heart. But I'd never want you to stay out of obligation or gratitude." "Obligation?" She shook her head, a smile playing at her lips. "Vaughn Garrison, for a perceptive man, you can be remarkably obtuse." Before he could respond, she closed the distance between them, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then bloomed into something deeper as his arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Nora rested her forehead against his. "I'm staying because I choose to. Because somewhere between you facing down the sheriff and us sitting by the fire in your cabin, I realized that freedom isn't just about being able to leave. It's also about being able to stay on my own terms." "And what are your terms?" he asked, his voice husky. "Equality, respect, and patience. I've never had the chance to discover who I am when I'm truly free. I need time for that." Vaughn nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I can offer all of those things, and whatever else you need." "What I need right now," she said, "is for you to kiss me again." He was happy to comply. Over the following months, Silver Creek watched with interest as the new schoolteacher settled into the community. Miss Jackson proved to be both firm and kind with her students, earning their respect and their parents' approval. If anyone found it odd that she spent her weekends at Vaughn Garrison's ranch, riding beside him as he checked his cattle or sitting on his porch reading poetry aloud, they kept such thoughts to themselves. Judge Wilson performed their wedding the following spring in a ceremony that blended traditional elements with some Arapaho customs, honored guests from Daniel's settlement attending alongside the townspeople. Gray Wolf presented them with a beautifully crafted quilt, a symbol of two lives woven together while maintaining their individual patterns. In her wedding speech, Nora's words resonated beyond the gathering, carrying a message for all who would listen. "1 year ago, I was deemed property. Today, I stand before you as a teacher, a wife, and most importantly, a free woman who has chosen her own path. The greatest gift we can give each other is not protection or provision, but the recognition of our equal humanity." Vaughn saw me as a person when others saw only something to be owned. He offered his heart not as a replacement for my chains, but as a companion to walk beside me. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Vaughn would tell the story with a wink. "Your mother was running away, and I helped her run toward something instead." And Nora would add, "Your father once told a sheriff I was a person, not property, and that I was his heart. It was the truest thing anyone had ever said about me." Their ranch prospered, expanding as they acquired some of Edward's former holdings after his conviction. The house grew larger to accommodate their growing family, 2 boys with Vaughn's steady gaze and 1 daughter with Nora's fierce independence. Nora continued teaching until she opened a small library in town, funded partly by her compensation from Edward's estate. It became a gathering place for all in the community, including the Arapaho from the Eastern Settlement, who contributed their own oral histories to be recorded and preserved. They faced challenges, of course, drought years that threatened the cattle, lingering prejudices from some quarters, the inevitable conflicts that arise between 2 strong-willed people building a life together. But through it all, they maintained the fundamental truth that had brought them together: that freedom and love were not opposing forces, but the same gift viewed from different angles. On their 20th anniversary, they sat once again on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky. Vaughn's hair had begun to silver at the temples, and fine lines marked the corners of Nora's eyes, evidence of 2 decades of both laughter and concern. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen me running that day?" she asked, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. Vaughn considered the question. "I like to think some version of us would have found each other anyway, even though I was technically another man's property." There was a teasing note in her voice now. Time had transformed the painful memory into something they could occasionally reference with the perspective of distance. "You were never anyone's property," he said, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Not even mine, especially not mine." "No," she agreed softly, "but I am still your heart, as you are mine." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the land in gold and shadow. On the hill behind their home, the graves of those they had lost over the years, Nora's father, reinterred from Missouri, Gray Wolf, Judge Wilson, were marked with stones and wildflowers. Before them stretched the future. Their children growing, the territory advancing toward statehood, the world changing in ways both promising and concerning. But in that moment, as dusk settled over their land, they were simply Vaughn and Nora Garrison, a cowboy and a teacher who had defied convention, challenged injustice, and built something beautiful from the ashes of what might have been a very different story. And that was enough.